This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager.
Welcome to Wagon Wheel. I'm Jarrod Kimber, and thank you again for joining me live if you're on YouTube or just listening anytime in your own time. Maybe you're listening to this 4 months after I record it because I said some random thing that you were desperate to hear about. But thank you to everyone, really, especially those who subscribe and follow. And what else can you do? Share and all those sorts of things. All these things help us very much. But the thing that helps us most, of course, is Patreon. And we have many questions on Patreon today. Feel free to put questions into the chat if you are watching live on YouTube. But super chats are probably your best bet of getting on, looking at the list of questions that I see in front of me. But if you do want to make sure that your question is answered every week, the best way, of course, is to go via Patreon. Submit your questions there and live your life in a secure knowledge that I will answer a random cricket question for you. Satchmo says, are the psychological stresses on cricketers different from any other sport given the constant treadmill of travel, hotels, and different formats? Yeah, I think there's also that it's kind of two different sports in one, right? So in bowling, you have that thing of you might be having your worst day, but having to keep bowling through it. And batting might have your worst day, and then that's it. So there are even different psychological stresses through that maybe we don't. Well, no, we do talk about enough, but maybe aren't always factored in. I think it was. I want to say Jimmy Anderson 1 year. And I want to say this is around 2012. Yeah, I think it was around the 2012 World T20. I think that's right, because I remember having this conversation with someone, what I think was around Sri Lanka, that Jimmy Anderson was going to be away for 300 days that year. I mean, to be fair, jobbing golfers and tennis players are probably fairly similar. I'm just assuming. So from that perspective, but it's weird because you're traveling with a group of people, but you also can't really escape that group of people. But yeah, I do think I don't know if it's different. It probably is different because you have batters and bowlers and they have different stresses to begin with. And the tours are so long. And I think that's probably the biggest difference. So I don't know, if you're a tennis player and you've got a tournament in Portugal and you don't like Portugal. I mean, who wouldn't like Portugal? But let's just say this person doesn't like Portugal. They're going to be there for a week or 2 weeks, right? In cricket, if you go to a place that you don't particularly like, what's the cricket version of Portugal? But you go somewhere that you don't like, and obviously you might be there for 2 or 3 months at times. Johnny Bairstow is going to be in India for an awful long period of time, from the start of the World Cup until the end of the IPL. He's got a Test series in the middle. There's just a lot going on with him. From that perspective, and that's going to be an issue, right? I mean, I don't think there's a way around that to make it. And he might like India, but it's not his home, and there's no variation, right? Other than within the Indian cities, of course. So I do think that's a issue, but look, it's kind of what you sign up for as well. Oh, says, who were the first coaches in cricket to use data? They say Woolmer was a laptop coach. Were there others before his time as well? So John Wright is the first one that I really brought it back to, who was using things like dot ball percentage. I'm trying to think what else John Wright was using. John Wright had a few advanced metrics that I found that he was using in the 90s with, I want to say Derbyshire, and then brought them in with India, and then did he coach New Zealand as well? So I think he's probably the first. Bob Woolmer used actual science. I don't know if he used data. I'm not saying he didn't, but I don't know if he used it on the same level. It's certainly, I've got his book behind me here somewhere, Bob Woolmer's Art and Science of Cricket. I don't remember too much about any kinds of data. Certainly not the sort of stuff I saw with John Wright. And then I want to say Krishna Tunga is sitting in the lobby during the 2001 Australia-India series, and he runs into John Buchanan. And so John Buchanan starts using that kind of data from 2001. I've talked to amateurs who use stuff. They were like amateur teams who had accountants and, people who understood all this sort of stuff that had used it before. There was really interesting stuff that from when the Moneyball book comes out, 2002, 2003, that a lot of the counties, because a lot of county cricketers who are baseball fans, so they knew about the book well before Brad Pitt, Jonah Hill got involved. So I think John Wright's the one I would probably, hang my hat on from that perspective. However, there would definitely have been people before him that would have done it, perhaps not as famous people, and certainly in amateur cricket, it was something that I've heard people talk about before. Oh, GD says, caught me in the mood for a rant. Indian cricket administration has long been the domain of selfish, short-sighted politicians and incompetent nepo babies. I think it'd be unfair just to say that was India. From the lows of Vizzy, Vizzy was pretty ordinary, to the highs of Bindra and Delmia. Delmia, for those who don't know, sued the national broadcaster to get their rights off. Before that, the BCCI were actually paying to get cricket on TV, which is, ridiculous situation. Then he talks about Srinivasan and the greed and everything else. This is a very long question, GD. But the current administration, with Jay Shah pulling the thread, seems to be particularly incompetent. There's been no investment on A tours or building a depth chart like roster to have the next man up ready to go. They botched scheduling and management of the World Cup. They lack the investment in the venues and the other indifference towards improving fan experience. Yeah, I think some of those things were certainly before Jay Shah. I don't think that is particularly him. The World Cup one's quite interesting because the ICC generally do the planning of World Cups. Now, there's usually kind of a hybrid. The local board and the ICC sort of work together. From my understanding, at the moment, as far as I'm aware, the BCCI wanted to run this tournament themselves. That has caused problems. And here's the reason. It's not that the BCCI is any better or any worse than any other cricket board in running a World Cup. It's that the BCCI has never run a World Cup. And not only that, the BCCI doesn't run the IPL, right? IMG. They do all the boring stuff, right? And we know that in cricket, Steve Elworthy became the World Cup guy. And, one of the reasons he, also played in one, but one of the reasons he became a World Cup guy is because he was very good at all the boring little things that you have to do to make sure a tournament goes off. The legalities and check in with local districts and check in local holidays and all those sorts of things. And quite clearly, the BCCI hasn't done this. I'm taking away the ticket fiasco because they should know how to ticket games. But there were huge ticket issues in the last T20 World Cup as well, including, I think my favorite one was if you turned up to Nagpur for any of the games, you were redirected back to the old Nagpur Stadium to buy the tickets. And anyone who knows Nagpur, not next to each other. So there has been problems with that before. And that's certainly an issue that we have seen. So yes, from that point of view, I just want to point that out with the World Cup. Lack of investment in the venues. You talked about A tours. I think the utter indifference towards improving fan experience, definitely not another Jay Shah thing that's been going on forever. Sadly, in so many grounds around the world. What is the worst thing the current administration is doing, and how is it hurting Indian cricket in particular, but also the sport in general? I would still say that, let's say conservatively, Indian cricket has between $2 to $3 billion in the bank. I'd say it should be more than that, but they don't open their coffers, and I don't know how much of the money they actually have. It would be a stroke of the pen for the Indian women to be the best team in the world and the Indian disability sides to be the best team in the world. So if you were really looking at something that Indian cricket could be doing straight away. And I remember having a fight with someone around 2016, 2017. I think Ganguly might have been in charge at the time, and saying it's ridiculous that India just isn't funding the women's team so they can just dominate it and get more trophies and, follow the narrative that they wanted to follow, really, as much as anything. And all these people are like, well, they'll do it. They'll do it when the time's right. And I'm like, time's right now. Spend the money now. All right. You will dominate the next 10 or 20 years of women's cricket. Probably more than that if they do it correctly. So I would say that is probably the biggest thing, problem. The fan experience is horrendous and should certainly be updated considering the amount of money. I also think that knowing how much it costs to build a cricket academy somewhere, it feels weird to me that we haven't just seen a bunch of BCCI backed cricket academies in places that don't have good first class setups. So yeah, there's quite a few different things there. But if you really want to know what I think they're doing most wrong, it's that they're running the sport in such a way that is milking the popularity currently of the sport. And I don't think they are safeguarding the future of the sport to ensure that the next generation and the next generation and the next generation still have the same passion that people have had since 1983 to now. So what's that, 40 years, right? That would be my biggest issue. And you could argue that's what happened with English cricket. That was the drop in English cricket, right? That it was the biggest sport for a long period of time, or at least, at football level, and cricketers were hugely famous and all these sorts of things. Well, it was the biggest sport for a big period, I suppose. But, cricket had all these advantages, and the ECB for generations didn't do anything other than milk the popularity that it had at that stage. And they didn't even do that particularly well, which you could argue again, perhaps the BCCI is not doing. You don't know that the next generation will do it. My perfect story, and I'm sure I've told this on Wagon Wheel before, when we started Death of a Gentleman and we're trying to make a movie about, cricket, everyone, and I mean everyone we asked for money from was like, cricket should just be more like golf. Cricket should do it like golf. And I was thinking at the time, because I'd always, been toying with other sports articles. And one of the articles I wanted to write, which has now been written 1,000 times, but at the time I hadn't seen an article like this, was that there was a whole generation of people who, when they finished other level, competitive sports, whether they played cricket or basketball or tennis, cricket, football, whatever it may be, they would get to a point when they could no longer do the athletic things they wanted, and they would move into golf. And that became the business sport and the retirement sport and all these sorts of things. And, you saw generation after generation of older guys moving into golf. And when we were doing the film, people were saying, it should be more like golf. And I was thinking, well, golf's a very different sport because a lot of the people who love it also play it. That isn't quite the same with, football or basketball or cricket. And secondly, I couldn't see how golf was going to go ahead and do very well because it was milking its own fans absolutely brilliantly, but it wasn't generating anything for that next generation. And when that generation, kind of my age and maybe a little bit older than me, went to cycling rather than golf, the arse fell out of golf a little bit. And golf got really desperate. And I've talked to a lot of golf executives, around the world, in the last 4 or 5 years, and they're just like, yeah, we would kill for T20 or a version of it or anything like that. The point is that you could have a sport that's really popular, but what are you doing to ensure that it maintains its popularity? And I don't know, other than hosting, a World Cup and hosting the IPL and those sorts of things, I'm not sure what cricket in India is doing. Now, perhaps there's so many people in India that it falls back and one day there's only 10% of the population like it. And that's still more than enough. I don't know what percentage of the population is fully engaged with cricket at the moment. But that's where I always worry about the way that, and this isn't an Indian thing, but this is right across the board. The Big Bash and the 100 both exist because of bad management from Cricket Australia and the ECB. That's not to say that they wouldn't have ended up with the T20 league anyway, but their specific kinds of T20 leagues are literally because they missed a generation of people. And I don't think you can be in a situation where you do that. And there's no reason for the BCCI to ever do that, right? It's, you have such an advantage if you are running cricket in India over any other sport that you should never be in a situation where you are not just growing and growing and growing and making it, you should be trying to destroy other sports is the wrong way of putting it, but ensure that, everyone's playing for 5th place, not even 2nd, 3rd or 4th. GD says, unrelated to my rant above, what could the BCCI do to help the next generation of players get ready for international cricket? Is it feasible to enter other franchise competitions with an A-ish squad? Yeah, I think, I mean, I've talked about that a lot. I honestly think India, Australia, and England are being idiotic in not having permanent A teams traveling the world all the time. In the same way their major men's teams are. And you could even have the A teams doing it more. And you could set up, if India, Australia, and England probably have 2 A teams in a competition, and you could chuck in, Sri Lanka and South Africa and New Zealand, whoever else you wanted to fill the other spots in that, so that your players had to play in those locations as well. Maybe a mixed Dutch, Scottish, Irish, European kind of team, all these sorts of things should be available. I think the amount of money that the Indian cricket is playing. I also think you could I could be wrong, but I'd be shocked if you could not monetize that. The other way, as is what you're saying, GD, of putting some of these teams into a franchise league structure. Look, we've seen that before. Not so much A teams, but we have seen, Scotland and Netherlands, Ireland playing county cricket. New Zealand used to have teams in the Australian domestic cricket. Obviously, the Namibia and British are a little bit different, but similar kinds of, situations there before. Trying to think if there's something with Bangladesh as well. No, perhaps there wasn't with Bangladesh, but yeah. So we've seen all those things before, and I do think they are. I do think it's something that is possible to be able to do, and to have these conversations. The weird thing is that you're talking about, allow the BCCI to muscle their way in on the Big Bash or the Blast, right? You could actually find yourself in a situation, GD, where you bring so much value by having if you had the next crop of Indian players playing in an overseas tournament, overseas franchise tournament, you're almost like a franchise owner at that point, right? And because of the amount of money that your players are making, you then have a bigger say. It's a really interesting concept. It could pay for itself at a certain point. Aditya says, do you follow the women's CPL? Wanted to know your initial assessment of Shriyanka Patel. I just love watching about. I have not seen her. I don't think I've watched any CPL at all, regardless of gender. So far, there's so many one-dayers on at the moment, Aditya. But I will copy and paste her name and put it in my notebook, and hopefully take a look at her soon. Probably not between now and the World Cup, if we're being honest. But I'll certainly keep a note of her name. Patrick says, does Australia's boom or bust batting approach make as much sense in ODIs as it would in T20? I don't think what they're doing at the moment, Patrick, is specifically it is boom or bust. It just lost to South Africa. They made 227 in 34 overs. So that was a bust, and I suppose some of the other games were a boom. But I don't think what they are specifically trying to do at the moment is... What's the best way of putting it? I don't think what they were trying to do is come up with a new method. I think they're trying to push the limits of what is possible for them. This is what would we say? This is somewhere between a full strength team and an A team. There's a few players here that weren't in the World Cup, squad. A few players probably playing out of position. Marnus is in the side. Alex Carey's batted kind of everywhere in this series so far. So, I think it's more, they're trying to see how much they can push themselves. I don't think you will see them playing the way that they have in the World Cup at the moment. Not that they won't still have that attacking part of it, but I think they'll pull back slightly because they'll have a slightly different team, and they might still want Hazelwood, Cummins, Stark, and Zampa. You can't bat the way they've been batting with that. But what they are flirting with is slightly different this game, because I think Abbott was at 8. But in some of the other games, obviously, they've had, the bowlers who can bat up until like positions 9 and 10. So I think they're just pushing to see what they could do. And, I think that's a good thing to do before a World Cup, especially with a team that's not quite full strength. And it gives some freedom to some of the players to, whack themselves into form. Overall, England didn't go in with a boom or bust batting approach, but what England did was they thought to themselves, we're going to push ourselves as far as possible because we're going to stack up our bottom, and we saw them beat New Zealand the other day with that kind of, losing too many wickets at the top, but still having enough players to pull out later and still attacking just as hard, even though that you're 5 wickets down, 6 wickets down. So yeah, I think Australia is looking at that, but they're also trying to find their own version of what will work for them. There's no one days that are playing at the moment where you should take your team's form too seriously or be too worried about it, because it is very hard to play, whether it's bilaterals like New Zealand, England, and Australia, South Africa, or even the Asia Cup, knowing that the World Cup's around the corner. There is a natural slow down twist and everything that happens to your brain coming into those tournaments. So I think that teams are aware of that, and they may be being a little bit smarter than they have at some other World Cups, perhaps. Ruja says, I hope I'm not going to go too overboard, but as much as I and others have made fun of him, was Ajit Agarkar actually an India great in ODIs? Well, that is, of all the questions I was ever asked. We used to use Ajit Agarkar as our punchline. So me and Andy Zoltzman used to do that, but we did it separately, and then we started working together, and we had to apologize to Mr. Agarkar directly, because he was well known in so many different cricket countries, and he was a good cricketer without being a great cricketer. And I think if you look in one-day cricket, you have a very good memory of that. But in Test cricket, obviously, incredible how few wickets he managed. Plus, he had the many ducks. He just looked like the sort of person who was consistently downbeat, broken-hearted sort of player. ODIs, 191 games, bowling average of 27.85, an economy of 5. All really good bowling numbers. And it's just want to have a look if he gives anything with a bat. Average 15 with a bat, maybe 350s. Not as great. Good batting era, though. They would have had a lot of good players. Still scored over 1,000 runs. I suppose this question partly just depends on how many players you are including. You wouldn't have thought there would be many players in Indian ODI cricket history who would have more games with a better record, especially when it comes to seamers. I would have thought even more so with seamers. So if you're looking at, what did I say he played? 191 games, right? So let's just look at that from the bowling. We know he's got a little bit of batting available to him as well. So if we look at India, which starts with an I, everyone, in case you're playing at home, let's do 100 games, because anything less than 100 games, and it's hard to be a great, which I think someone might have asked me a question in the chat about Trent Boult, whether he's considered an ODI great. Well, he's played less than 100 games. That would be my bigger issue. So if we just look at bowlers, Agarkar has the 3rd most wickets. He's got a better record than Zahir Khan, all things considered. He's got a very similar record to Kapil Dev when it comes to average. Obviously, economy is a little bit whiffy there. Tendulkar took 154 wickets. My God, he played a lot of cricket. Average of 45. I would have thought his average would have been better on that low usage. So I would have to do a lot more research to put Agarkar into it. But if you add that little bit of plus batting to it as well, certainly he would have to qualify as one of the best Indian seam bowlers that we've ever seen in one-day cricket. I think that would be a very, very hard thing to argue against. And if you look at the fact there's only been 10 or 15 by the look of this, guys who've ever taken 100 ODI wickets. And he probably hasn't also been swept away by the modern crop because they perhaps have not played enough. So if you look at Bhuvi Kumar, he takes 141 at 35, really good economy. So that does bring him back into the play a little bit. Yeah, it's a very fair question. I have the bigger issue, I suppose you would have, Rudra, is if you don't have a lot of good bowlers, does that mean he automatically makes it? Or do you say, well, we don't have a lot of good bowlers, so his figures look better because there aren't as many good people to judge him against? And I think that's probably where you would have to work out where you would want to be on that kind of end of any spectrum. Will says, should the Asian Cup be played in a country like England where there's enough sunshine to allow for ODIs to be played in one day? I was actually thinking about this recently. This World Cup obviously makes 100% of sense to play the Asia Cup in Asia. But I was wondering if they're really going to be smart and it ends up being, ahead of T20 World Cups and One Day World Cups. Would it not be best for them all to so they played the last Asia Cup in Asia somewhere. I can't remember. Was it UAE? I can't even remember now. And then they all came to Australia not long after to play the World Cup. Would it not have been better to contact South Africa and go, would you like to host an India? Would you like to host several India-Pakistan games? Good joke, obviously, Will. But I think this is the thing. If TV rights are the most important thing, you just want to have the game or streaming rights. You just want to have the game at the right time, right? And that's kind of how it works. And then if you can give your teams or, your region in this case, an advantage, should be thinking about it a little bit, right? Nadika says, what are the best rivalries between non-test playing nations? So I think traditionally the Ireland-Scottish one, I know Ireland is now a test playing nation, but Ireland-Scotland, certainly from 70s and 80s, maybe even into the 90s, was a very fiercely fought rival. And those teams still, if I'm talking to the Scottish people and I bring up something Ireland, they will be upset. And Ireland still has a bit of an issue with Scotland, although because they got test status and moved on a little bit, it's more probably the Scottish who have an issue with the Irish. Traditionally I want to say Denmark and the Dutch didn't like Sri Lanka because they thought Sri Lanka was given special treatment by being put automatically in the World Cup. So they played grudge matches between those places, and obviously Sri Lanka beat them and were the better team, and they still should have been a qualifying event, of course, but Sri Lanka were the better team. So that's another one. USA, Canada has had decent rivalries over the year. I've got this feeling that Uganda has a really good rivalry. There are a lot of teams who hated Afghanistan. I don't know if you'd say that if Afghanistan had reciprocated any of those feelings. But yeah, a lot of teams in the associate world were not particularly happy with them. And I can't remember the Uganda one, but I feel like I'm missing one more obvious one that an associate head would know. So very recently, and I don't know how much this is tongue in cheek, but obviously Brazil was Argentina was always really good at cricket, and Brazil never really played cricket. And then of recent times, Argentina started to slightly get better again, and Brazil has this, women's team. And I have heard that they are at least trying to flame up that rivalry. Whether it's a natural thing or more of a marketing gimmick, I don't know. But I suppose it's one to watch. I'm trying to think if there's any other women's ones that I know of. No, I can't think of any off the top of my head, where the two teams just don't like each other that are outside the sort of major teams. But yeah, a lot of it in the associate world is I think there are a lot of teams who are upset at Kenya for, the ability to host major events after, one win against the West Indies, and suddenly everyone wanted to go to Kenya and play one-day cricket and all these sorts of things. So I do know in the 90s there was a bit of resentment, but I'm not sure there was a resentment from anyone particular. It's not like the Kenyan and Namibian teams hate each other that I can think of. There should be one with the Dutch, but I think Peter Byron just won the hearts and minds of all people. All right, let's take a break here, and we'll come back and we'll do even more Patreon questions. You are listening to The Wagon Wheel, and I am Jarrod Kimber.
Picture this. You made a video, and now you want the world to see it in their favorite social media platform. You could bowl into the wind by slaving away making edits, or you could let Memento effortlessly cut those epic moments down, making them perfect for your social media followers. It's like having a runner. You play the shot, and they do all the hard work. Sync up your podcast and YouTube, and they will be the substitute fielder who does all of the work. With Memento, you can craft a long innings down to the best highlights. Make your content, but let Memento cut it. Dive into even more cricket with our other show, Jarrod Kimber Podcast. Join us 4 times a week for live recordings and fascinating conversations. Discover Wagon Wheel, Uncovered, Footmarks, and Red Inker. Shows that cover fan questions, weekend highlights, articles, videos, and thought-provoking discussions. Be part of our entire cricketing community.
Welcome back to Wagon Wheel. I remain Jarrod Kimber, and let's go through Patreon questions. James says, if you were tasked with compiling 5 minutes of video footage to go aboard a deep space probe that would communicate to extraterrestrial aliens what cricket is and why we love it, what would you include? 10 clips of 30 seconds each. Okay. Whoa. Because it's hard, because there are clips that I would like to send, like Elise Perry bowling on a broken leg. But can you, does that need to have subtitles on it or something? Can I cheat and have that? I'd probably have, a collection of Viv Richards playing the short ball, I suppose, would be something instantly. Probably worn bowling to, someone like Cullinan or a Taylender would be another, really, really interesting clip. Keith Miller batting and bowling and fielding and the whole 9 yards might be another one. The MS Dhoni 6 in the World Cup. It's Sobers the 6-6s in black and white might be another one. Zoe Goss getting up Brian Lara in the charity game. Yeah, no, look, it's an interesting question, because I think you want to show all the different facets of the game. So you want some, Wackar's Yorkers, for instance, and Larwood's bounces would be really, really cool. Murley and Morn bowling, probably the two obvious, so sort of most dramatic bowlers of spin that we've had. Rod Marsh or Alan Knotts or Jack Russell doing something special with the gloves. You're probably looking at for one or two of each different thing that you have available to you, because that's cricket's big advantage over other sports, isn't it? Maybe there are so many different kind of variations on that than there might be for others. So you want a slips catch, you want a short leg catch, you want to catch out on the boundary, all those sorts of things. But yeah, I don't know how you would decide what goes in and what doesn't. It's a really, really fascinating one, though. Rudra says, how have England managed to develop so many all-rounders in the past 10 years? And how much credit do Peter Moores or Trevor Bayliss get for that, given that when Moeen, Wokes, Bester and Stokes had already established themselves in the team? Yeah, I mean, Moores and Bayliss don't get any credit for that, and I've never heard them take any credit for that or suggest that they should. Oh, at a certain point, you would have to say that all-rounders are naturally gifted. So if you look there at Stokes, his father is a athlete himself. Stokes probably could have played multitudes of different sports. Moeen Ali, not only was he a very gifted all-rounder, but he didn't even take his bowling seriously for a very, very long time and still has the ability to do that. Sam Curran, again, very naturally gifted athlete. Wokes is probably another naturally gifted athlete as well. Besto is the son of a cricketer. So it would be hard to sit there and say that, all the, and you could argue that I think Liam Plunkett and Adil Rashid probably could have done more with the bat if they'd had better coaching at time. And not better coaching, but better usage. For instance, Adil Rashid makes a lot of his runs early in his career when, Darren Goff is forcing him into the top order. And then he sort of gets allowed to move down the order and not work on his batting as much. So, all-rounders are natural, and it's usually to do with either being highly skilled, which is kind of the Ashwin type of all-rounder, or it's just being a freak athlete like Imran Khan or, Garfield Sobers and Kapil Dev and those sorts of guys. And, sometimes when you are those sorts of players, the skills come later because you've been in the game so long and you're seeing the game from both sides and everything else. But the majority of the best, okay, let's just have a look. If we did the best all-rounders in Test cricket, I just want to see. Let's come up with them in history. Okay, in history. So Flintoff certainly could have played other sports. Phenomenal athlete. Tony Gregg, I can't believe he's on this list. Bleacher Report. Tony Gregg, good cricketer, but what are we doing here? Kapil Dev, certainly, again, brilliant athlete, could have played multiple sports. Sean Pollock, comes from a long line of, he had a father and an uncle who were, one was a good bat and one was a good bowler, and he kind of combined it. So that goes back to the family aspect of all-rounders again. Ian Botham, brilliant athlete, did play professional football. Richard Hadley comes from a family of cricketers. His father was a New Zealand captain. Very, very good athlete himself. Keith Miller, maybe one of the best athletes we have ever had in cricket. Imran Khan, maybe one of the best athletes we've ever had in cricket, although couldn't field at all, which is bizarre. Callis, he's a good athlete in his own way, but, maybe built more like a rugby athlete than a cricket athlete traditionally. And Garfield Sobers. There's a lot of athletes there, right? And all-rounders tend to come from that kind of stock. In order, you kind of have to be an athletic freak, or as I said, very skill-based freak like Ashwin, or maybe Vinu Mankad might be another one there. Aubrey Faulkner might be another one, to be able to be good on both sides of the ball. So it's not that coaching doesn't matter. It's actually very hard to coach young all-rounders because your time is split between them. You can't spend as much time on their batting or their bowling as you would ever want. Josh says, how much would it help New Zealand's odds at the World Cup if they had a spin bowling all-rounder who bats at 42.5 average, strike rate of 118, being the fifth option with his off-spin? Yeah, Bracewell would be very handy if that's his numbers. I'm assuming it is. Look, I think some of those numbers are a little bit, and I'm just guessing it's Bracewell. I now need to look it up to make sure. I think some of those numbers are a bit soft in that, we are talking about 19 one days at the moment. But it doesn't matter what his record is. What Bracewell allows for is he's a proper Jadeja. I'm trying to think of someone else in world cricket. We don't have many good number sevens anymore, but he's a proper number 7 hitting player. Perhaps you could put Moeen Ali. Moeen Ali would be another good one there, where he is going to play in attacking weight. I think New Zealand might have used him slightly higher up the order at times as well. They may have even been thinking of him in that kind of Joss Butler role. So you get to the 35 over mark and you just bring Bracewell in. That's, I think, what they were hoping he would be. Look, his off spin is in development, and would be very much tested by the best players in the world playing against him. But he also would have been playing in Asia, so he would have had that advantage. The other thing is that he allows then for them to have 2 spinners in the side, both of which who can bat, and they spin it in 2 different directions. It still would have given New Zealand an issue that I think Santner really has stopped taking wickets in the last 3 or 4 years in the middle overs. I think that's right. And Bracewell is probably not a natural wicket taker in those overs either, although he has some of the tools to be able to do that. So it might have caused a problem from that side of things, but it would have just given them incredible flexibility. Bracewell's really interesting because his figures look incredible, and I can understand why anyone would be excited by him, Josh. He's clearly not a 42 average player, and he's not going to have an economy of 5 probably throughout the majority of his career. But let's say he's the 9th best player in New Zealand, which you could argue is higher, but they've got a lot of good players. 9th best one-day player in New Zealand. He might have more of an impact because of the way he opens up that lineup. And Jimmy Neesham's a really good player, but making him bowl a lot of overs is going to be a little bit tricky. And also, perhaps what you want is Bracewell and Neesham in the same side, so that you can. And then you've got Santner as well. Then you have those guys at 6, 7, and 8. And then considering the matchups and everything else, you can chop and change and do a lot of different things with those 3 bowling options that make up the 20 overs. And then you've got a little bit of Glenn Phillips if you needed it as well, or Daryl Mitchell even. Although I don't see Daryl Mitchell bowling much in the World Cup. And because of Bracewell not being there, they're trying Rachin Ravindra, who's obviously not that kind of cricketer, isn't as dynamic, isn't ready, isn't as huge. I mean, Bracewell's just muscular, big hitting dude, right? Ravindra isn't any of those kinds of things. But it's a very interesting one, Josh, just because I do think he's, no matter where you rank him in New Zealand players, he's just so important because he gives them so many different looks at a team. Ian says, if Warner Murley had been born in the same country, how would you have used them in Test cricket and around the globe during their careers? If they're born in the same country, I suppose at a certain point it depends on what country they are born in, because if they're born in Asia, they would certainly play all the Test matches in Asia together. You would have thought that Warne and the way that he played, but also his batting and fielding would have sort of instantly given Murali might have been relegated to second spinner status. But in any conditions when the ball was really ragging, I think Murali probably becomes their number one option. So a little bit like how Jadeja and Ashwin work together, I suppose. Maybe that's a good template. The only difference is that Warne and Murali had the ability to be much more successful outside of Asia, which means you can play them together a lot more. So you wouldn't play them both together at the Wacker. You wouldn't play them both together at Joburg or on green tops in England occasionally. But I do think a lot of surfaces around the world, you probably would have played them both, in part because they both put so much side spin on the ball that they didn't need the spinning surfaces as much as other bowlers, other spinners might. So Jadeja needs some assistance from the pitch. Ashwin doesn't need as much, but even Ashwin doesn't put the kind of revolutions on the ball that Murali and Warne do. So you would think that 50 to 60% of the time, minimum, maybe more than that, actually, 70 to 80% of the time, you probably want to play both of them because they spin the ball in two different directions as well. And what you might want in that situation is a fifth. If you had a fifth bowler who was a seamer, so Shane Watson with hamstrings, Steve Waugh with hamstrings, slightly better Craig McMillan, all those kinds of guys. It would be great if you had a proper runner, but if you had someone who could bowl you, at least 10 to 12 overs of secondary seam, you could play I think you'd play Warne and Murali together quite a lot. Bloody Bugger says, my impression is that the pitches 20 years ago deteriorated more, had more cracks. Certainly, no one will lose the car keys that we have, car keys that we will have in pitches today. Yeah, so the old Tony Gregg putting his car keys in. Why is this? Is it because pitches back then were flatter, but those flat legs in Pakistan didn't have many cracks either? I believe it's not just, I don't think there was as many cracks as we remember, Bloody Bugger. I think that was probably a few key surfaces that cracked, and some of those still do, right? But the bigger difference was that pitches deteriorated in many different ways back then. You had a lot of pitches where, in places like Sri Lanka and India, you might have 3.5 days of really good cricket, and then kind of you couldn't bat at the end. Very hard to chase in England when you still had sideways movement and you had a little bit of variable bounce. Australian pitches did crack more than other places. I think as pitch technology has come on, the pitches are much more stable. And as I said, I don't think it's just cracks. And I do think that, we're probably never going to be able to really tell this, but perhaps if we went back to the early Hawkeye data, we could have a look at it. But my guess is in fourth innings that pitches just don't deteriorate the way that they used to. And I believe that is just a natural continuation of us knowing more about pitches. If you think about the history of cricket pitches, it really isn't until the 60s, 70s, and 80s that uncovered pitches become covered pitches. And from then, think about all the technological advantages we've had, the more we've learned about horticulture and everything else, the more pitches that we have, the more, professional. And we have to work out how to grow them in one place and pick them up and move them somewhere else. And, the UAE curators have to work out how to have an Asian style pitch and a European style pitch and an Australian style pitch all on the same square. Sorts of things that just didn't matter before. The ICC having a say in ground management in certain places means that you sometimes, if you're a curator of your local ground, you now have access to other people that can help you. There's a lot more information. All these sorts of things I think have changed, and I think that's why it is. I think it is easier to bat on the fourth innings than it has ever been before. Neron says, do county teams have any incentive to sign overseas players? Durham already top of Division 2 table, but they signed Vishwa Fernando for the last 2 games. Wouldn't that be a perfect opportunity to try out their second 11 bowlers? I suppose there's a couple of things here. It would depend on whether they thought there was a second 11 bowler that would be helped in that situation. Overseas players help you get publicity. So if when Durham signed an overseas player, there will be local articles written. The BBC will talk about it. It will probably end up on Cricinfo. It helps in that perspective. County fans also, I wouldn't say that they expect them, but it is a part of it, and it's very much a ticket sales thing. Also, having overseas players helps with your streaming and your social media. You're right. In this kind of situation, they might have been able to go with it in a different way, but you can also see why they might quite often when you see a player get signed for the end of a county season or on a short-term contract, it's also the county trying to work out if this is someone that they want going ahead. They're seeing this person play in different conditions in a different role, perhaps. They want to see them in their conditions, bowling or batting the way that they want them to. So there is a little bit of that. Perhaps, Marcus North just had a little bit of extra cash around and decided that, he does. You never want to not spend all your budget, right? If you don't spend all your budget, what happens is next year the bean counters might take some of that budget off you. I don't know. Could be that. I'm not going to ask him. Sandip says, did the Indian batters expose the Pakistan spinners? If Pakistan seamers can't take early wickets, then opposing teams can score higher totals. Yeah, it's kind of what I've been saying for ages. I think it was, I can't remember, one of the Pakistani players made a joke of like, oh, if our seamers keep bowling like this, we'll be fine. And of course, that's true and also impossible, right? Even over the course of a World Cup, eventually injuries, bad form just are going to take over. And that's my issue with Pakistan, which is I don't think their spinners can take enough wickets. I do think in the right conditions, they can contain people, but I don't think that they can take enough wickets. And I think to win the World Cup, you have to be able to take wickets at the top, in the middle, and at the end. And the middle is always the toughest place. Finding bowlers that can do that consistently. Adil Rashid averages 32 with the ball, and yet is instrumental in what England do because of his ability to take, a wicket and a half a game, because that is the tough part of the game, to be able to take any wickets. And if your top bowlers take 2 wickets and your middle take 3 wickets in between overs 10 and 40, it means you're only 1 wicket away from the tail, right? And if someone gets on a roll at one stage, or the ball reverses, or a spinner gets on top or gets a bunch of good matchups or whatever that may be, you're in the game. You really have to take them. And that was always my concern with, I think my concern with New Zealand and my concern with Pakistan is that ability to take wickets in the middle overs. Vivek says, who would you have in an all-time 11 if you could only pick players who have played with prescription glasses? Jim Fote. I would have Jim Fote. Chris Rogers. Todd Murphy. Who else has had glasses? I feel like I'm missing some great old glasses wearers. Have we had any fast bowlers with glasses? I feel like we should have if we haven't. Do you know what, Vivek? I'm going to be honest here. I'm not a person who notices glasses. I think I might have picked 3 of the people that I can think of all time. I mean, there was certainly some really, I feel like I'm missing a bunch of 70s and 80s guys who wore glasses when they played. I suppose these days more players wear prescription lenses. And I think that Chris Rogers, for instance, used to wear glasses when he fielded and prescription lenses when he batted, or something like that. And I know a couple of players who probably do similar things like that. But yeah, I'm not the go-to guy for glasses. Cricket talk. I had to find a limit eventually to my own nerdish obsessions. Niran says, just want to thank you for the awesome content. Well, thank you, Niran, for supporting me on Patreon. I love the Basil D'Oliveira video. It's amazing that we get to watch these for free on YouTube. Well, technically, Niran, you didn't, because you paid for it through Patreon, but thank you. What is the video that you had the most fun making? I bet you really enjoyed the New Zealand Opener series and the Neil Wagner video. Yeah, New Zealand Openers was incredible because it's such a boring, stupid topic. But every time I peeled a layer away, there's just another story that I could actually believe existed from all one group of people. And so I think that was the one where I kind of expected the least and maybe got the most. I'm trying to think what else. The Ben Dunk one's probably another one, right? Like, what I love about, and thank you to everyone who subscribes and does all these things to all the videos and is on Patreon and everything else, and buy me a coffee and the advertisers, Wicket Cricket Manager and the others that help out as well. What I like is that I'm in a situation now where there's no way if I pitch the Ben Dunk video to Crick Info or Crick Buzz or I know The Guardian or BBC or ABC or Times Now, like no one's taking the Ben Dunk video, right? And I don't know how many hits that video had. It's probably 20 or 30,000. It's probably not, one of the biggest successes we've ever had. But, for me, that was a really, really interesting story. And, it allowed us to have like real freedom in the way that we made it. And, we wouldn't, as I said, we would not have been allowed to tell that story for anyone else. And so again, I suppose that's the kind of video that I really enjoy, the ability to go deep into a topic that I know that if I was working for a major organization, they would. And, Cricinfo were pretty friendly with me. I once read an 8,000 word piece on fast bowler's hair, which I will make into a video one day because it definitely needs to be a video. But yeah, I think that, Ben Duncan, Neil Wagner as well would certainly be up there. I really enjoy doing the most improved players thing. There's something kind of really exciting about looking for how players have changed and what's happened. And, is it real? Is it not real? And all those sorts of things. So I think those are the ones. But thank you to everyone who comments, who likes, who subscribes, who super chats, who follows, who shares, all those people. Everyone plays a part in this. All right, we'll have a break. After the break, I've got a super chat from the other day that came through at the end of a video that we didn't get to read out. And I think a couple more have come through on Patreon. But if there's any super chats in the room, we will also get to those as well. You're watching the Wagon Wheel podcast, and I am Jarrod Kimber.
Love sports and want to write or podcast on it? Look no further than Fans with Laptops. It's a specialized course tailored for aspiring sports enthusiasts like you. Uncover the secrets of the press box, learn how to create compelling stories from scratch, and discover the best methods to share your content online. Support us on Patreon. Join for exclusive perks like AMAs, live calls with me, and a vibrant Discord community. Enjoy ad-free content, early podcast episodes, and access to my emailer, plus behind-the-scenes stuff. We've built our channel on Patreon support, so a huge thanks to everyone who has helped.
All right, welcome back to Wagon Wheel. Jarrod Kimber here. So we had a super chat the other day, and sadly, I don't have the person's name here. Oh, wait a minute. Eric Ignon, I think is the name. It's a question about Anil Kumble. Is it? Oh, for fuck's sake. Sorry, everyone. Anil Kumble has actually done pretty well in Australia. If you disregard his first series in Australia, where he took 5 wickets at 90, in the rest of the 7 matches he played, he took 44 wickets at 32, which is pretty close to Nathan Lyon's average in Australia. Can you think of any reasons why he was so successful? I think in Australia, you either want to spin the ball a long way sideways, or you want to be able to get a little bit of bounce. Yeah, it's seven matches, 44 wickets, but I think that would have been his thing in Australia, would have been that little bit of bounce. He could actually bowl with top spin as well, not in the way that Nathan Lyon and Shane Warne do, but he did get a little bit of, over revolutions on the ball at times. But I would have thought it would have been his height. And my memory of him, I always felt weird. Ashwin and Kumble, and I'd probably throw Harath in. I think there was a couple of spinners where I thought they bowled very well at times in Australia, but the wickets just didn't come. And they managed to tie teams down, tie Australia down and confuse Australia at times, but they just couldn't continually break through. And I always thought that Kumble was a constant threat in Australia, even if he wasn't always a wicket-taking option. And that's probably how I thought of Harath and Ashwin as well. It is very hard to consistently take wickets in Australia as a spinner, especially as you go to the Gabba and it turns in one way. At the Wacky, you're probably not going to play. The MCG is a little bit different again. Adelaide Oval gives you a little bit of assistance, but probably more towards the back end of the game. And the SCG was friendly for spinners, but kept that reputation even when spinners weren't doing as well there. So, I do think from that perspective that, Kumble was maybe better set up than some of the other players some of the other great spinners had been, just because he did have that height, which is a very important thing. Sorry, I'm just trying to bring up the other Patreon questions. And of course, the app has frozen on me. Here we go. Vika says, I feel like the ICC is torturing us with these ODIs. I think this World Cup should be the last one. I consider myself in the top 1% who follows cricket. And if I can't watch 50% of the games, then what's the point of ODI cricket? Is there any other reason for the ICC to keep the ODI World Cup other than if it one big tournament every year so they can make more money? I mean, all cricket exists so that people can make more money. It's still a really popular sport. The reason ODI cricket still exists is because TV companies love it. It's not a popular sport compared to T20 cricket, and it maybe doesn't have the brand value that Test cricket has, but it works. And while it's working, the ability, it's the old Harsha Bogle line, they get to show 100 ads. And that's a really important part of why one-day cricket still exists, which is why Test cricket still exists as well. It is making money, if not always at all times. And Hamza says, what is more valuable in a T2011? A player who has a high strike rate at the death, or a player who has a high strike rate against spinners? Oh, a player with a high strike rate against spinners. There are so few players in T20 cricket, Hamza, who have great records against spinners. It's great strike rates against spinners, I should say. It's really not something you see all that often. So from that perspective, it's a massively different variable, whereas there are a lot of players with high strike rates at the death. You can find those all the time. I've got a couple of super chats here to finish up the day. Ab. What do you think of AB de Villiers, the Test batter, considering his away average of 55, an excellent record in all conditions? I think he's a fantastic player. I still think Virat Kohli is probably going to do him on longevity when it comes to the best all-format batter of all time. But if you're talking about best all-format peak player of all time, it's AB de Villiers. As a Test player, he still played 100 tests. Average is 50. As you said, very good away from home. One thing I would say is, I'm just trying to bring up his data here, 2004 to 2018. So he basically bats through the best period to bat in, with a couple of years at the end as it gets a little bit ickier. Having said that, he played on a lot of dodgy. South Africa it's funny how this is not mentioned much anymore, but South Africa were openly rigging their pitches to make them tougher for batters, believing that their players were stronger and could take more hits on the body than the opposition could. And he played through that era. So certainly from that perspective, he also had to put the gloves on himself for a while. And he had that slow start at the beginning of his career. So look, I think he was a magnificent player. We're doing our top 50 batters of all time list. I would be surprised if he doesn't push for that list. May not make it, although he does have the 100 test matches, which I do like. I'm trying to think. It's about how long is his career? Because he started quite young, didn't he? It's a 14-year career. And because of the away average and the wicket keeping, I think it would be very hard for him not to make that list. He's probably not top 30 or top 35. He probably tops out a little bit shorter than that. But an absolutely fantastic player. This is going to sound weird, but I don't think we saw the best of AB de Villiers as a player. I think there were so many issues, so many things going on with him. Split allegiances, not always being happy with South Africa and everything else. We saw little peaks where he was the best player he could be. But I think if he'd have been the sort of driven person like a Steve Smith or Virat Kohli or Jeffrey Boycott, Sunil Gavaskar, Kumar Sangakkara, I think he had the ability to go beyond all those guys. But that is another ability, right? That that Bradman-like thing of every run matters. AB de Villiers maybe didn't quite have it in the same way and was a different kind of player, and so because of that, didn't quite come out. But absolutely fantastic cricketer. Prana just sent one. Sorry, Pranjal sent one. Oh, did I put arbs up? Probably didn't. Probably reading it off the side like an idiot again. Pranjal sent one super chat, which says, let's say there's two spinners on the same ODI team with identical stats, except that one has 60% dismissals of bowled, LBW, and infield catches, and the rest are outfield catches, and the other player has the opposite. Which bowler would you prefer in that case? So you've got a situation there where I think Liam Plunkett is the best example of this. If you go back and look at Liam Plunkett's bowling, Pranjal, I think you'll find that the majority of his bowls were probably pulled on The majority of his catches were probably caught at deep mid-wicket. That was the plan, right? And there are going to be spinners whose plan is, Rashid Khan is not trying to get you caught at deep mid-wicket and, long on and those sorts of places. Imad Wasim probably is. And, Benny Howell is a very good example of someone who bowled a lot of people, but also got a lot of people caught at long on and long off. And that was part of the plan. The plan was, I'm going to try and get you bowled or LBW, but if you just try and hit dead straight through the line, I think that we can get you at a long on and long off repeatedly, and literally would bring his fielders a little bit closer. It wouldn't bother him if you were dragging across the line or opening the face a little bit. These are genuine plans in T20 cricket, and for me, if you're talking about, let's say these two spinners are on the same ODI team, but they have only played 20 games each, then I would always go with the bowled LB and infield catches. But if you're talking about someone who's played 100, both players played 50, 75, 100 games, and they've managed to maintain those records, I'm not thinking that's a fluke at that stage. I'm thinking that's their plan, and that's how they dismiss people. It would be the same of trying to think of the test version of this. But yeah, look, it is something that is talked about sometimes by teams, but I think it's one of those things of ugly wickets don't count as much, and realistically they do. And if you are someone who was good, like and Plunkett, I know he's not a spinner, Pranjal, so it sort of ruins your analogy a little bit, but Plunkett is a perfect example of someone who found a way to be consistently take wickets that was not the normal seam option in ODI cricket. And because of that, I think he was a chance of not playing in the World Cup final, because World Cup at times, because I think there was a feeling that Pudsey was not as good because of the way he got his wickets. And it would have been a real mistake, I think, from that kind of point of view. I think it's a very different situation from a normal kind of bowler. But I'm looking for consistency of wickets with a method. So if there is a method that is getting these fielders, these batters all caught in the deep, that's okay, right? If there's no method and it's just dumb luck, then I'm hoping that there is maybe something that the bowler is doing that is making these mishits go there. Whether it be, let's say, if it's spin them or overspin, or in Plunkett's case, that cross seam deliveries and the way that his balls would stop more when they hit the seam in a different way. So yeah, I do think from that perspective, it doesn't matter to me. But I get the question. It's a very clever question. But yeah, I couldn't imagine that would ever matter all that much to me. More looking for someone. People have come up with some glasses players, which I should have known because they're all really modern ones. Although I'm not sure that any of these players are, other than Imam Al-Haq, are consistent glasses wearers. Do we need consistent glasses wearers? Because I think there's a big difference between someone who occasionally wears glasses and doesn't. But obviously Dan Vettori, certainly. Ganguly on occasion, Kumble on occasion. So yeah, there's some good glasses wearers there. I didn't want people, imagine finishing this whole hour-long podcast and just being like, there are some really obvious ones there, Jarrod. So thank you to everyone in the YouTube chat, as always. And thank you to everyone who listens to this podcast. Now, however you listen to it, even if you somehow managed to bug my office. Apologies for all the farts that I usually give. We just had the Basil D'Oliveira video. If you haven't seen that Basil D'Oliveira video, I think it's probably as good a video as we've ever made on this site. Really proud of the team for the work that they put in. We turned it around really quickly. Something I've been wanting to do for a long time is look into the cricket merits of Basil D'Oliveira's non-selection. It's a long video. Save it, watch it for the weekend, send it to your grandfather, whatever you have to do. But if you don't know the story, it's definitely worth you going and checking it out. And if you do know the story, I think that I've looked at it in a way that probably hasn't been covered directly before. So many people focus on the politics and the backroom stuff, which is really fascinating. But I hadn't seen anyone really go into it especially someone with my sort of analytical background, you know, and someone who's done cricket selections for franchise and national teams. I really wanted to go into it from that point of view. And so we're really happy with that. But World Cup week, not World Cup week, World Cup, our World Cup videos start in about 2 days. And our first video is actually about the 2 new balls in one-day cricket. So really a fascinating story. We dived into the stats, and I found some things that I was not expecting to find when they went to the 2 new balls from the old system of one good ball and one not so good ball. Anyway, subscribe, follow, tell your friends, do all those things. Any way that you can help support the network, even putting a comment up on YouTube, all these different things help. And thank you to everyone who does. And we will see you again for Uncovered next week. Goodbye.